I burned through the first season of Squid Games, realizing how all the games that they had shown us were the ones we grew up playing. But unlike others, I do have a real painful, traumatic experience with one of the game of Fire and Ice. It was back in 2006. We were all new to the middle school shenanigans, and I was peculiarly not very much socially cognitive, so there were many barriers to me completely understanding what someone wanted me to do or behave like. It was a busy Monday afternoon. Our mathematics class was over, and we were all bored as hell. And then we decided to play a nice game of Fire and Ice when we get to go out. We all already picked up our teams, so we don't waste time in the field. And I was coupled with Melina. Melina was the slowest one to do that, and I was not really aware of things back then. I was diagnosed to be on the spectrum of autism, and back then my cognitive behavior was very different from the children I used to play with. We were a bunch of misfits who hung out together and played so much. Good thing that the children I hung out with were sympathetic and really accepted me despite my behavior that was strange to a lot of people. So the bell rung, and we were all outside. And then we count till 10 and started the game. The game started with Jack making every ice, and then I had with me Melina. Melina was a slow runner. Jack was quite fast, but I was much faster than him. The first thing he did was freeze Melina on the spot. I quickly unfreeze her with the fire, and then we started running again. Every time he would freeze, I would unfreeze her. Knowing this, he decided to freeze me, but I was too hard to catch. But then he quietly hid, and then snuck up on me and freeze me right beside Miss Clavince's car. I was stuck, with no hope, since I never really thought that Melina would unfreeze me. I stood there waiting for her, when I smelled something. It was like a burning fuel that I could smell. Then I looked over and there it was. Miss Celamine's car was sparking, and a little fire broke out. I wanted to run and tell someone, but I was freeze, and I wasn't really allowed to move according to the game. Now this might sound stupid, but my understanding of things was limited at that age, and then as I waited, I saw the fire burning up and becoming quite big, and then it was reaching the engine. It probably started with the AC about 5 minutes later. The fire was substantial, and no one dared come near it, while I was standing right beside it. But I couldn't move until Melina unfreezed me. Everyone was shouting for me to get back, but I just wouldn't, and nobody dared to come near since the fire was unpredictable and could blow up any time. So I just stood there. And so did the adults that were supposed to come in and act. They were busy shouting from the distance. Melina saw that and was crying until she understood what is to be done, and she looked at me and came running in a rush. Even though Melina was a slow runner, at that moment, she was as fast as one can be, and she came rushing in as the adults just watched, and she unfreezes me and held my hand, and we started running away from the burning car until it exploded. I was down, and Melina was down. I'd hit my head on the pavement. Melina had a little scratch on her hands. I never let go of her hand. We were rushed to the paramedics immediately, and everything was checked for. I never let go of her hand, and neither did she. If it wasn't for her, I would have been dead. But here I am, alive and well. And as far as her hand goes, I haven't let it go yet. Melina and I got married after our graduation in 2014. And as we sat in front of the television, binging on Squid Games, we recalled the day we sealed our fate. Okay, so this isn't strictly my story, but the whole thing involves my grandpa and my great aunt, a sister. But since they're no longer with us anymore, it's one of the most horrifying true stories I've ever heard. And I figured I'm within my rights to tell it. My grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in a really poor town out in Oklahoma. I mean, The way my mom tells it, they really didn't have a pot to pee in. They used to eat stuff like dandelion salad, literally just eating boiled eggs with wild dandelions. They were that broke. Even worse for my grandpa and great aunt, who were like 12 and 8 years old, respectively at the time. There's absolutely nothing to keep them entertained. They made a good go of it, turning pieces of junk into toys. Like never see that old-timey thing of a kid wiping a bike tire along with a stick? Yeah, that kind of thing. Their childhoods were just not like ours. They were accustomed to extreme boredom, grinding poverty, and back-breaking labor. So you can guess how excited they got when they heard the carnival was coming to town. There'd be games, rides, candy, sideshows, absolutely everything a kid that age could ever want. The only thing was, their family didn't have the money for them all to go, just enough for 2 entry tickets with a little left over for cotton candy. So being the good folks they were, my great-grandparents decided they'd give the kids the money while they stayed home. Must have been like all their Christmases had come at once. The only condition was that my 12-year-old grandpa was not allowed to let my 8-year-old great-aunt out of his sight. Then on the evening in question, Grandpa and Great Honor given like 50 cents between them and told me back by sundown. Then they ran off down the pasture where the carnival had been given permission to set up the way my dad tells it for the first hour. So Grandpa and Great Aunt had the time of their lives. I think tickets were like 5 cents or something. Then cotton candy was 2 cents apiece. Basically, the parents had underestimated how expensive stuff would be, so they were able to partake in everything the carnival had to offer twice. Maybe that's what led them to a false sense of security, because it certainly accounts for them staying long after the sun started to set. Only when my grandpa realized how late it was, and he started looking around for my great aunt. She was nowhere to be seen. I want to remember asking my dad why they just thought it was okay to let their kids go running around in their own like that. If it's just like an old-timey thing, or because they were so poor. Dad said it was more like because all the people going to the carnival were their neighbors. They didn't figure there was any risk. But then there's my grandpa, totally unable to find his sister, and he's starting to get worried. He started asking all the people he recognized from our town if they'd seen his sister, but they all said no. Right up until one of our neighbors said they saw my great aunt walking hand in hand with the grown-up. I think they figured it was my great-grandpa or something. But when my grandpa explains that his dad isn't even there, this guy launches into action to try and help find my great heart. So Grandpa and this random neighbor guy apparently ran away with the actual carnival and towards where the workers had set up their trailers and whatnot. That's when they heard a girl crying from inside of them. The neighbor tries to open the door, but it won't budge. So he starts banging on it. Some evil son of a gun opens the door and tries to explain it away by saying my great aunt got lost or something, that she's just inconsolable, crying in a way that Grandpa had never seen before. Scared, but sad at the same time. This neighbor then rushes my grandpa and great aunt home and tells their parents all about what had happened. My grandpa knows something bad happened to my sister, but it just doesn't know what, because she won't talk about it. Obviously, my great-grandpa was absolutely furious, so he grabs a shotgun, rounds up a few buddies, and they went down to the carnival to basically do God knows what to the sky. Again, this is all from my dad. But according to him, this huge fight starts at the carnival. People on all sides almost get shot. Then they all freeze after the carnival chief fires a gun into the air. He then agrees to parley with my great-grandpa. That after talking for like 10 minutes in some weird-looking corny trailer. As Great-Grandpa walks away from the carnival empty-handed. Everyone thought he was crazy. Some monster had just put his hands on his only daughter, and after a short powwow with the man in charge, he was happy to just walk away. His buddies confront him on it, obviously wanting to know what the deal was. My great-grandpa apparently tells him to put a sock in it, because it's all been ironed now. That night, my great-grandpa apparently puts on his boots and headed down to the carnival one more time before it left town. It meets up with this carny chief, who asks if my great-grandpa still wants satisfaction, which he obviously did. The carny chief beckons to two workers who carry out like a basket or something before laying it in front of my great-grandpa, and they invited him to open the lid. He complied, and when the smell hit him, I doubt he had it in him not to pew, because according to my dad, the carnies had stacked the offending worker's separate head on a pile of his own guts, and his own junk had been stuffed into his mouth. The carny chief then told him, while pointing at his junk, first we cut off this, then we cut out those, then point to the guy's guts. Only when he stopped moving do we cut off that, then points to his head. Apparently after that, the carny chief once again asked my great-grandpa, "Are you satisfied?" He just nodded, turned, and then walked away. The carnival was gone the next day. I think he told my great-aunt what happened to that guy too, because she never seemed to turn off about it. No, something really bad must have happened. They killed the guy, but she actually went back to the carnival the next time it came around and borrowed a phase from my son, I guess. They were built different back then and just dealt with trauma differently or whatever. Or maybe it's much easier to get over this sort of thing when you know the guy who did it suffered on Earth before he died. I suppose that's what freaks me out so much about my grandpa's story. That almost sounds like it came from a different country or something. All that poverty and vigilante justice. I just don't recognize that same kind of thing in America today. Not in such an extreme way anyways. And that sure had me counting my blessings, let me tell you. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
I grew up in the 80s in this little town called Durant, which is about 6 miles east of Brandon, Florida. Until I was 15 years old, my best friends in the world were these two little kids, Bobby and Joey. We were basically inseparable. Not only did we go to the same elementary and middle schools, but we spent all of our free time together. Bobby and Joey were like opposites. Like it was weird that we were even friends to begin with. Bobby was more outgoing, while Joey was more reserved. Bobby would eat just about anything, while Joey was easily the fanciest eater I've ever known. It extended to almost everything, including how scary they found horror movies. And boy, do we love horror movies. We tried just about every trick in the book to sneak into the theaters to watch The Thing or Nightmare on Elm Street. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes not. But when we did get in, the result was always the same. Joey would be on the verge of a panic attack for the entire show, while Bobby would be complaining about how it all looked faked or how it wasn't scary enough for him. Nothing seemed to be able to freak him out, not even the transformation scene in The American Werewolf in London. He was impressed. Sure, Kanan is the least bit grossed out or whatever. And I suppose that's why we thought the haunted house or the traveling fair wouldn't scare him either. It was late August of 1985 when the traveling fair came to town, and seeing nothing good was showing down at the local movie theater, we figured we'd stop by to see what it was all about. It was all the usual stuff. Cotton candy, fairground rides, BB shooting galleries, etc. But the thing that caught our attention was the haunted house. Virginia Beach traveling fair looked pretty cool and was certainly more of an attractive prospect than the carousel. So after finishing the hot dog, we headed over to the ticket booth to ask them how much. I remember the guy in the booth. He had all the skeletal face paint on, and when we asked him for 3 tickets, he put on the spooky voice like, "Are you sure you boys have the constitution for such a terrible trial?" We were just like, "Yeah, dude, just give us the tickets already." We walk up towards the entrance to go inside. So the way this thing was laid out was like a giant box room that had been divided up into corridors. You made your way through the various corridors, some which narrowed so you had to squeeze through them, and ever so often, a mechanical doodad would jump out to scare you, or an actual person would. I'll admit, the actual people, one of which had on a pretty cool Wolfman mask, are pretty creepy. Especially the woman who pretended to be a statue right up until we tried to pass her, and she touched my shoulder, and it almost gave me a heart attack in the process. Got to applaud their level of commitment and subtlety, right? Anyway, Joey and I thought it was pretty cool, even though he was so scared he was ready to puke. But Bobby thought the whole thing was done. So much so that he walked right up to the ticket vendor and demanded his money back. Of course, the guy just points to a little sign that says, "No refunds." But he does so in such a dismissive way that Bobby just about explodes. He started ranting about how it is the worst haunted house he'd ever been to, and that no one in their right mind should ever pay for anything so terrible. The guy talks to us for a minute or two, lowers his voice, and says something that seemed to calm Bobby down. Then when he walks back to us, we found out that this is what the guy had to say. "If you want to see something scary in there, come back later at around 10 p.m. If you're still not satisfied, we'll give you your money back." It seemed sketchy to say the least, but Bobby assured us that the guy was serious, and somehow we got into our heads that we were beginning to see the adult in the house. Bearing in mind, we were kids who had trouble getting into our rated movies, so I don't think I could underestimate how excited we were. We heard that traveling carnivals were known to get a little risque after dark, so the prospect of getting to see that sort of thing in action felt like a real adventure. Joey and I had a curfew at 9 p.m., but we got around it by saying we were staying at Bobby's. Only Bobby's mom worked as a night nurse on weekends, so there'd be no one around to disprove that. It was a foolproof plan. At least, it seemed that way for a while, but as a matter of fact, our little visit to the carnival would end our friendship and change our lives forever. The first time that something was wrong was when we showed up and the whole place seemed to be closed down. There were lights on here and there, a few workers wandering around, carrying heavy-looking tools, but other than that, the place was deserted. At first, I figured the guy just played a trick on us, as in, come back later, but I'll be long gone. But Bobby was determined to get his money back, and we followed him through the carnival grounds until we came across the haunted house. True to his word, the ticket teller was sitting on the steel chairs that led up to the entrance. He made some comment about being surprised, which showed us how he figured we were too chicken to come back for the midnight show, as he called it. We just laughed. Midnight show. It wasn't a minute past 10 p.m., and there he was trying to be all spooky again. But then, Bobby asked him what was so scary about the midnight show, and if he'd be given a refund if it didn't frighten him. Again, the guy promises, if it doesn't spook him, he gets his money back. But what he said next really set me on edge and immediately had me thinking twice about my decision to return. He started by saying how the carnival didn't like leaving paying visitors unhappy, and if we wanted to be scared, he could show us something that had to leave us very frightened indeed. He said it was something to keep in reserve for those dissatisfied with the haunted house, something that very few have come to witness without losing their sanity altogether. He said only a small, dedicated crew handles the midnight show because the sheer psychological strain of the performance can be extremely harmful to their mental health. I remember Bobby piping up like, "I'm not dumb, dude. I see what you're doing. He's just gonna beat the snot out of us when we get in here as payback for talking smack." The guy laughed, then swore on his mother's grave that each of us would walk in on our own volition and walk out unharmed. As for our sanity, he couldn't guarantee it would still be in one piece by the end. Joey was out from the word go. He's like, nope, screw this, I'm not going in. Bobby, on the other hand, was typical Bobby. I don't think wild horses could have dragged him away from that carnival. But for me, there was something about the way the ticket vendor was talking. He wasn't trying to sound scary or be scary. He actually sounded kind of scared himself, almost like he didn't want us to go in. And either he was an Oscar-level acting talent, or there was really something to what he was saying. I'll never forget the way Bobby looked at me when I said, yeah, I'm good. Actually, I think I'll stay here with Joey. It was like disgust mixed with ridicule. I know for a fact he thought I was being a big baby for having let the carny dude psych me out, but I made up my mind and I wasn't going to budge. In the end, Bobby went down on his own. Well, Joey and I waited for him outside. I could tell he felt a little nervous walking in, but I was nervous too. I was nervous for him, because as much as we'd been reassured that nothing was going to happen to him, a little piece of me thought Bobby was going to get his bell rang as soon as he walked in. Me and Joker outside for maybe 10 to 15 minutes waiting for Bobby while wondering what could be going on in that haunted house. There wasn't any noise or anything, and our walkthrough in the daytime had taken like 5 minutes tops. So when 20 to 25 to 30 minutes went by, we started to get pretty freaking worried for Bobby. Only right when we were about to go banging on the door of the haunted house, Bobby reappears with no limps, no swelling, and no bleeding. He looked okay, but he wasn't, and I'm not sure Bobby was ever really okay again. I remember walking back to his mom's place like it was yesterday. The exasperation I felt when we asked Bobby what happened, and all he said was nothing. We were flabbergasted. It certainly didn't seem like nothing had happened, because Bobby was definitely shaken up by something. At first, he was pale, visibly shaken, and he had this kind of vacant expression on his face. It's hard to explain. He seemed mostly shocked by whatever it was he had just seen, but he was definitely disturbed too. We kept begging him to tell us what he'd seen, but he just wouldn't say. All he gave us was nothing. Stop asking about it. We asked him if it was scary, and he said yes, but he denied any kind of violence had occurred. The guy promised he wouldn't be touched, and he'd apparently been true to his word on that, too. But that didn't mean they hadn't done something to Bobby. And despite all his denials, I know that was the case. The last thing he said about it before he threatened to kick us out of his mom's house if we asked again was a couple of hours later when Joy broke down and asked him, "Dude, I'm begging you, at least give us a clue what happened in there." "Something that doesn't make sense," Bobby replied. He never talked about it again. I know that seems unbelievable, but time moves pretty fast at that age. We were due to start our junior year of high school. I started dating that first semester. Joey broke his arm on Bobby's skateboard that winter, and there was other stuff to think about. I'm not saying we just forgot about it. And it came up in conversation once or twice in the months that followed, but every time we brought it up, Bobby would just give us this look, and the one time we persisted, he just walked back home without a word and didn't return our calls for a week. I'd like to say that dropping the subject for good repaired our friendship, but it didn't. Like I might have said earlier, what happened that night was the beginning of the end of our little friendship triangle, and we slowly began to drift apart. The end of the end, if that makes any sense, was when Bobby and his mom moved out to New Hampshire for her new job. We all promised we'd keep in touch, but we never did. And I think Joey and I just bummed each other out after that, and we were wondering what happened to Bobby, always hoping he'd call someday, but he didn't call. And we didn't even get the number for his new place. I still think about Bobby an awful lot, and I still think about him saying something that didn't make any sense. I've racked my dumb brain for literally decades, but I just can't work out what he meant by that. My wife thinks he was lying, and that those carnival workers really did lay hands on him or something. Just because he didn't have any cuts or bruises doesn't mean they didn't slap him around or threaten him a little. And besides, you can do a lot worse things to someone without leaving a black eye or a bruised lip. I sometimes wonder if that really is true. What would happen to him that was so traumatic that he just couldn't deal with it? Bobby was a brave man. I think he was the bravest and most defiant person I've ever known. If the tough thing needed doing, Bobby did it. And I think that if that thing just so happened to be opening up about being hurt or something, Bobby would have done it maybe later than rather sooner. But he would have, and I think I'll just end it there. Whenever I talk about Bobby, every third word out of my mouth is maybe. I'm so sick of maybes I can barely even describe it. I just hope his story isn't over yet. But he's out there somewhere, living a happy, fruitful life. I tried to look for him on Facebook ever so often, just to see if he made an account or something, but I've had no luck as of yet. But maybe next week, or maybe next year, I'll finally find out what happened to Bobby and get to say hello to an old friend in the process. Maybe. Just maybe.
I used to do a lot of babysitting work in my teenage years, and one Halloween I got an offer good enough that I legitimately canceled my party plans. Not my party, obviously, and I won't brag by telling you how much I got, but the family's first choice canceled last minute and they were desperate. Anyway, the job is a dream one, the kid is adorable, and there's minimal trouble at bedtime. Then after the kid fell asleep, I'm left to kill some time in the usual way, watching TV, texting, ordering pizza, etc. Anyway, since it was Halloween, I'm watching a few spooky movies and shows on TV. Shout out to the Treehouse of Horror marathon on Fox. Then all of a sudden, I start hearing something talking in another room. Now bear in mind that I think I'm home alone there, so hearing another voice while knowing the kid was asleep. Jesus Christ, I remember how my heart raced all those years later. It wasn't even just normal talking or whispering either, but this low, almost demonic voice speaking to another one. Ugh. It put the fear of God directly into me, I swear. I just jumped in, ran to the kitchen to grab the cordless phone and a knife, and then started edging towards the room I heard the voices coming from. The whole time I'm like, I need to protect this kid. But the fear of knowing I was going to be the first one to get got was honestly one of the worst things I've ever felt. Then right as I hear, 911, what's your emergency? And I know the dispatcher will hear whatever has happened. I burst in the room with the intruders, brandishing the knife and shouting, I got the cops on the Furbies. It was Furbies talking to each other in the middle of the night, in the dark. I had to explain to the dispatcher that there had been a horrible mistake and that I was so sorry. I honestly thought that they'd be mad that I called for a false alarm, but the nice lady explained it's better to be safe than sorry, and then hung up. Definitely the single scariest thing that's ever happened to me on a babysitting job, and yes, I am embarrassed. But I'll never forget that feeling of vulnerability and still knowing I had a responsibility to protect someone. Anyway, it all worked out in the end because I admitted the whole thing to the kids' parents when they arrived home, just in case the cops called by to warn them about the calling. They didn't, obviously, and I was just paranoid they would and that I might end up losing any future work from these two. Luckily, they were actually kind of impressed that I'd protected their daughter like that, and only ever called me in the future when they needed someone to babysit. So, all's well that ends well, I guess.